Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Dialexicon podcast, a podcast targeted at the youth, where we critically engage in philosophy and correlate philosophy research, all at an easy to understand and digestible level. My name is Sarah Shrivastava, and I'm your host. This week, we're joined by a really special guest, Dr. Jana Mohr, director and co-founder of PLATO, which is a philosophy and learning and teaching organization, and for many years was the director of the Center for Philosophy for Children, which also merged with PLATO in 2022, and is also an affiliate professor of philosophy at the University of Washington. Hi, Dr. Lone. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Although I will say it's Plato, like the philosopher.
Right. I think
of our organization.
I've butchered that name a few times, even in classes. But yeah, Plato is probably the pronunciation that I should be using. But thank you for your time and for being here today. Before we begin our discussions, since I ask everyone who joins the podcast, especially since there's a lot of kids watching and we have similar stories, but how did you get into philosophy and what stood out to you?
Well, that's a great question because I think it raises a big question about what actually is philosophy. Because I would say I got into philosophy very young when I started thinking when I was 5 or 6 or 7 about questions like, why do people have to die? Or what's the purpose of life? Or what does it mean to live a fulfilling and a good life, etc. Or even questions like, are numbers real? Or why is there hate in the world? So I think I was drawn to philosophical thinking very early, like a lot of us, I think, and especially a lot of children. But I didn't call it philosophy. I didn't know that word. And it wasn't something, of course, that was and is not still generally thought of as connected with being a child. So I continued to think about these questions and talk with my friends about questions like this as I became an adolescent. And then my senior year of high school, I went to a big public high school in New York. One of our history teachers decided to teach a philosophy class. So it was an elective and I took it and I was like, wow, I've been doing this my whole life and I didn't know it was a thing. And you can actually like study this and you could make a living doing this. And it was just kind of blew my mind completely. And that was it for me. I majored in philosophy in college and, onward.
Were there like specific branches that you found interesting, or was it just like the entire idea of like, the childhood questions that you had and like answering those types of questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think there were certain questions I was more drawn to than others, but I wouldn't say that I had a particular affinity. I mean, I was really interested in metaphysical questions. I was really interested in epistemology and in ethics and aesthetics. Ended up doing my dissertation when I started to work my PhD in philosophy of law. So I have a pretty wide-ranging interest in philosophical questions.
Okay, yeah, that's awesome. And then I guess maybe just to summarize, or if you could summarize like philosophy in one word, what's the word that you would use to describe philosophy to
In
you?
one word, I don't know if I could come up with one word, but I would say one phrase that springs to my mind is an adventure in thinking, because I think philosophy is all about curiosity and questioning and kind of thinking imaginatively.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess it's kind of like opposite of what philosophers do, since philosophy texts have a lot of words. So reducing it down to one is quite funny, I guess. But I
Yeah,
did want to move on.
go ahead.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think questioning is maybe at the center of it, but I wouldn't say that questioning is synonymous with philosophy. So I don't know about
Right. Yeah.
thing.
I've heard from some philosophers they're like, a good paper should lead you to more questions than answers,
Yeah.
in philosophy, which definitely rings a bell when you come like actually start reading,
Yep.
because there's so many things that will rise up.
Yeah. There's a
But I
good
wanted to
quote. I'm trying to remember who said it, but it's if you have all the answers, you're not asking the right questions.
that is a really good quote.
Yeah.
Uh, I did want to move on to kind of talk more about what work you've been doing with Plato.
Mhm.
So could you tell us a little bit about Plato's mission and how it aims to promote philosophy education amongst young people? And also maybe if you could talk about like what inspired you to create the organization?
Sure. So Plato's mission is to nurture young people's curiosity, critical thinking, and desire to explore big questions. through philosophy and ethics programs for students, for educators, and for families. So we work with a lot of different constituents. We do classes for young people in schools in person, as well as lots of online programming for young people. We work with educators, both classroom teachers, librarians, as well as academics, to provide resources and training for how to do philosophy in classrooms, which is, in our view, a very different enterprise than it generally is in the university. And I can talk a little bit about that if you'd like. We also work with families. We do lots of intergenerational programs, bringing families together, bringing young people together with older people to think critically together about, important critical questions. We also have a lot of resources on our website that are open access for families, for teachers, for students to think philosophically and to, be able to find resources for reading or getting involved in more philosophical programs. And then we have 2 journals. We have quite a bit of programming really that we do. And it's all really geared towards reaching young people kind of where they are. And so trying to provide as much very accessible, easily reachable resources and opportunities so that we can reach as many young people as we can and try to limit the barriers that often are present when people are trying to when people get interested in philosophy or are trying to think about exploring the discipline.
So is that like why you were inspired to create it? Is just because there's barriers everywhere?
So no, actually partly, but my story is that when I got out of college, I went to law school and I was a lawyer, practicing lawyer for about 5 years. And I worked a lot with, particularly with women and children. And I began to observe how profoundly disempowered children in particular were in the legal system. Their voices were just not heard. And I began thinking about how to empower young people. That was really kind of at the core of what interested me in this work, is to think about ways to empower young people and to help them find their voices and understand how important their own perspectives are. And so as I said, I was practicing law, then I had my first child, took a year off. I'd been working on my master's in philosophy while I was practicing lawyer. I finished my master's, decided to pursue the PhD, and then I had a second child. And then as I was starting to work on the dissertation, my oldest son then was about 4 years old, and he was starting to ask the kinds of questions I articulated that I asked when I was young about, purpose in life and death and reality, etc. And I got very curious about this. And at first I thought, well, maybe this is just kind of a genetic thing in my family, and maybe it's not true for all children. So I asked his pre-K teacher if I could come in, it was pre-K, and do a little philosophy with their classroom. And so I did that, and it was just wonderful. I brought in usually literature, stories that often the children knew, picture books, and they would raise questions about, what it means to be brave or what constitutes a friend, et cetera, et cetera. And these young 4, 5, 6-year-olds were just reliably interested in having these conversations. And at the same time, I found Gareth Matthews' book, The Philosophy of Childhood, and just turns out, and I didn't know anything about this field, and it just turns out that Gary had been one of my undergrad professors. And so I wrote to him, because this is pre-email, and he was just a really lovely person. And he wrote me back and he said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're interested in this, and you should meet this person, that person." Anyway, he was very helpful. And that's what led me to do this. I decided this is one way that I can really contribute to children being able to kind of take control over their lives, to trust the way they see the world. And I think philosophy is particularly suited for this because we deal with unsettled questions. And so it really does carve out an environment for students to explore without worrying that there's that one right answer that they're not getting or that they're supposed to know. And so it allows you to play with ideas and to think critically and to explore, and of course, to learn how to give good reasons and how to anticipate counter arguments, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all part of thinking about these big questions. So that's what led me on this path.
Wow, that's a really touching story. And honestly, I think a lot of parents can maybe like relate to that experience with kids. Cause I know like, I mean, I don't really remember my childhood that much, but like I know for a fact that like these types of questions do spring up a lot. And even it's not, it doesn't just like end at an early age, it, like continues throughout like elementary, middle, and even in high school. Those questions just keep on getting bigger and expanding as you kind of like face the world and experience the world. But I did want to ask, just because times have been quickly changing with like technology. So has this kind of like innate curiosity changed over a period of time? Maybe with kind of with how kids are like more using technology at a younger age, and they're more interested in other things outside of like like these types of questions. Like I know I've heard that a lot of parents are like, oh, my kids don't want to go outside anymore and play. They just want to like be on their phone or like be on the laptop or something like that. Is this the same with philosophical questions, or is that innate curiosity still there?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously I have a bias, but I think absolutely it is. And I actually think a lot of all of that is about what we model for children. So, if we're on our phones all the time and not outside, well, then, our children think that's what we're supposed to be doing. Um, but my experience is that children, and not just children, but all of us are curious about the world and have these big questions. And maybe as we get older, we often don't spend as much time wondering about them, or we don't feel like there are spaces in which it's very comfortable to talk about them. But it's pretty rare that I meet someone who doesn't think at some point about some of these big questions. And for children, I think those questions are really at the forefront because the world is still so new. So even though there's technology and there's the ability to kind of, use technology to find answers to certain things, you can't Google, what makes a life a good life. I mean, I guess you could Google it, but I don't think what you'd get would be particularly satisfying. And my sense is that children, like children throughout history, I expect, wonder about the world in which they find themselves because it is so new and strange. And I don't know that technology has changed that fundamental fact.
Right. No, I was just wondering, just because it's been like a while since I was that age, obviously. And I just have been thinking about kind of like the way in which we are changing in response to technology. And I
Mhm.
feel like if these are like innate questions, maybe there's like some evolutionary reason behind it. There's like different perspectives that come into play here,
Mhm.
which opens more questions. What a surprise. And so I guess like I wanted to ask kind of how your organization, like Plato, addresses the issue or like the common perception that like philosophy is really abstract, it's really esoteric, and it's like not relevant to everyday life. It's kind of like one of those things that you have like the armchair philosophers will think about it and we'll just like go about with our daily life, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So how does the organization kind of like address that? And what's your like your take and view on that?
Yeah, it's an important question because I think there is a perception generally that philosophy is very esoteric and kind of removed from, what really matters in ordinary life. And I think that's to some extent the responsibility of the philosophy establishment, which has not, in my view at least, done a particularly good job at shifting that perception, and in some ways has intensified it. One of the things we really try to do, because I hear this all the time. I mean, I'll have teachers say to me, if I'm talking to them about coming into their classroom, a teacher will say something to me like, oh, I took a philosophy class in college. It's not going to be like that, is it? And I say, well, I'm not sure what your class was like, but the way we do philosophy with young people is not to teach philosophy to children, we do philosophy with them. And by that, I mean, we see philosophy as kind of part of being a human being. So it's not, it can be something you study. You can study what some of the great or contemporary philosophers have to say, but that's just one way to do philosophy. We all engage in philosophical thinking, at least at certain moments in our lives. When you ask yourself, what's the right thing to do? Is this person really a good friend? You're engaging in philosophical thinking. And so that's the way in which we try to explain this, is to help people recognize that these big questions that children have, which most of us, if not all of us, recognize that children are asking these questions, are in fact philosophical, and that can be the beginning of learning to think philosophically and to sort of cultivate a sensitivity about the philosophical dimension of the world that's really important for young people. And so I think there is this sense, like, philosophy that's either too hard or too abstract or not very important. We do kind of work against that. And there have been times over the years where people have said, maybe we should use a different word. Maybe we shouldn't call it philosophy. But it is philosophy. And it's really important to me to reclaim that, and also to demonstrate that young people are philosophically minded and that they have philosophical capabilities, and that this isn't limited to adults, and it certainly isn't limited to adults with advanced degrees.
So as opposed to like just teaching philosophy, more about like teaching the strategies that philosophy uses, like the
So
questioning and all those things.
yeah, well, right. So what we do, I mean, typically, so in an undergraduate philosophy class, or even in many high school philosophy classes, you'll study the philosophers, right? So you'll study Descartes' dream argument, for example, and you'll be able to articulate what it was Descartes was trying to do in that argument, and how that relates to the history of philosophy and epistemology, et cetera. We don't do any of that. And of course, kindergartners aren't going to be too interested in, Kant's theory of knowledge, for example, right? So what we do is we recognize this sort of natural interest that many young people have in these kinds of questions. And so we bring in prompts. They can be literature, art, music, thought experiments, games, activities that we think are philosophically suggestive. And those lead then the class into a discussion about whatever the topic is that the class finds interesting about this prompt. So for example, I might bring in, say, a chapter from a book that I think is going to raise questions about what counts as knowledge, or the difference between knowledge and belief. But in fact, the class wants to explore friendship and the nature of friendship, because that's what they took out of the prompt. And so that's where we go. So my job isn't to kind of provide content or control the content of the discussion. It's really to facilitate them thinking philosophically. So it's to make sure that they're able to give reasons for their views, that they understand when someone gives a counterexample and how to respond to that, that they are able to listen to other perspectives and to recognize that these are complex questions and there are many ways to come at them, and that there might not be one right answer, and often is not, if they're philosophical questions, to the topics that we're exploring.
Okay, yeah, I think that makes sense. And I guess like you were mentioning how like your programs, or at least they're working like when you're talking about kindergartners, I'm wondering, does Plato like work with all the other kids? I know, like I mentioned, like there's like the philosophy bowl, I think it is. So like is that like more with high schoolers or like
Yes,
middle
so we
schoolers?
have
Okay.
we have programs for, elementary, middle, and high school. And with high schools, I mean, we might be reading texts that are, maybe we might read Descartes, for example, or Plato or Aristotle or whatever. But the focus still will be on creating what we call a community of philosophical inquiry. So in kind of creating a classroom discussion environment in which the students are really in control of where the conversation is going. So you're, as the instructor, you're facilitating it in the sense that you're helping to make sure there's progress in the discussion, but you don't at the end of it have a list of, all the arguments or philosophical concepts you want to make sure they took out of it. So it's much more about the practice of philosophy than it is about the study of philosophy. But yes, we run an ethics bowl. We do online courses for all ages. We also we have programs in which we're going into high schools in Seattle. We actually have a program called the Philosopher in Residence, in which we have people who are in the school 2 days a week, and they work in various classrooms, and they work with teachers, and they do parent programs. And so that was typically in Seattle, and historically that's been in elementary schools. We've just expanded it to high schools. And so we have three, one in a high school in Seattle, one in Philadelphia, and one in Boston. And we're also have started a program called Philosophy and Ethics in high schools, where we send trained philosophy instructors into a school. And it could be just for 1 or 2 sessions on particular topics that come up in a class. So let's say it's a science class, and the class wants a couple of sessions on the nature of infinity or scientific objectivity or whatever. So we do that, and we're expanding that now, or we're working to expand it so that it will be national, and so that we can provide virtual instructors for high schools who are not near these kinds of resources, and who are interested in having someone come in and lead some sessions about various philosophical topics in their classrooms.
Okay, I think that makes sense. And so is this kind of how like philosophy can intersect with like other fields like STEM or like the arts? Or is there anything else that Plato does that kind of like directs? Because I feel like there's a lot more interest in those types of areas, just especially with the recent boom of like AI, and like a lot of people are getting into these things. So like, is that something that you've seen with like kids at school? Like they're kind of like engaged, maybe like, for example, especially with AI, there's a lot of questions around ethics now. So like ethical questions or ethical dilemmas being presented inside of these classrooms. Is there like a shift towards that? Is this how like intersections work with
Yeah, I
Plato?
mean, there's always, there are new questions that arise with the changes in society, whether it's technological or social or political. And so those new ideas and questions lead to new philosophical areas. But to some extent, the kind of way in which you might explore these, that's not that different, right? So I mean, an ethical question is still an ethical question. It might be about a subject matter that is completely new in some ways, but it still is from a familiar territory, in the sense that it utilizes moral concepts and ethical kinds of exploration.
And do you think like these types of engagements are necessary for kids that are going into different fields? Like, do you think philosophy is something that like kids should be having a basis in before they go into those other fields?
Well, I do, because I think that all fields raise philosophical questions. I mean, there are deep philosophical questions that underpin any field. And what we've found is thinking about these kinds of questions, which often come up in classrooms, really engages students in new ways. There's been a lot of research about bigger questions being raised, particularly in high school classrooms, that then are not taken up by the high school teachers, for two main reasons. One, because there's a lot of pressure on the teachers to kind of get through the lesson plan, and they don't feel like they have time to step away and explore these bigger questions. And two, because the high school teachers, this isn't familiar territory for them. And so it's a little bit intimidating to kind of enter into an area in which you as the instructor don't have the answer any more than the students do. And so you kind of have to become a co-inquirer in a way that is very new for many teachers.
Right. I think that makes sense. And I guess I wanted to ask a little bit more on how that process works, because like you just mentioned, they have to get through a lot of lesson plans. And like, is this something that where Plato will go at at a school level and ask teachers to do this, or is this something that teachers will adopt? How do they make it so it's like a student actually needs to reflect? For example, I was thinking like, let's say you're talking about I don't know, like something that has to do with ways of living life, and you have journal reflections. Now journal reflections obviously cannot be graded, they can be graded for completion, but what's the kind of like willingness for a student to engage in those things? And how do, like, from an administrative point of view, how does Plato help in kind of making students actually engage, as opposed to like this is another one of those things that we have to do at school just to pass or whatever.
Right. Well, I mean, we do a number of different things. So we send people into the schools so that it is not necessarily the teacher doesn't feel like they have to like learn a whole new subject or take on something completely new. So that has been a very huge part of what we do. We have a philosophy in the schools program where we send people into schools to do, as I say, either occasional philosophy sessions or regular philosophy sessions. Sometimes it's once a week for the whole school year, depending on the school and depending on what's needed. But I think in terms of grading and sort of entering into the school, that kind of level of the school culture, that's not what we tend to do. So we'll work a lot with teachers who are interested in starting philosophy courses or bringing philosophy into their subject matter. And we'll help them think about ways to both do that as well as to assess it. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to have students, especially in high school, write philosophy papers that certainly can be graded. And it doesn't, I mean, we do this in college, right? We have a wide range of what students can write about and how they want to do this, but there's a rubric that says, it has to do these things. You have to be able to provide reasons. You have to be able to consider alternative points of view, et cetera, et cetera. So that's part of philosophy, particularly once you get to the high school level. I think that's at the elementary school level, obviously it's a little bit of a different matter.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I guess also like just I know we talked a little bit about why philosophy is like necessary, even if you're going in different fields, because there's like a bunch of philosophical questions in all of those fields. But in general, why is philosophy education for students and kids good? Because you've edited a book called Philosophy and Education, Introducing Philosophy to Young People. And I guess what is the sole reason why these questions should be nurtured from a young age as opposed to like introducing them later in college, or like what is the benefit as like from society's point of view? Are we training better critical thinkers that can like change the world, or is it just like to cultivate a better sense of the self?
Well, I think it's all of those things. I think that, I mean, in my own view, there's no better subject than philosophy for cultivating critical thinking and analytic reasoning, because it really pushes you to think rigorously, to be able to provide strong reasons, to be able to evaluate reasons, to understand why one reason is better than another, which I think is particularly essential right now, where there's such a push towards relativistic thinking without much examination of what relativism really entails. Because if you really start to think deeply about relativism, most people will conclude that it's incorrect. So having an opportunity to really think about values and why we believe what we do. And, often people hold really strong views without being able to really articulate the basis for those views. Students will say to me all the time things like, it's a lot easier to say what you think than to say why you think it, which is absolutely true. And so I believe that philosophy gives students all kinds of tools to evaluate the world, to evaluate information, to be able to think carefully about whether something is reliable or not, whether a reason is sound or not. And I think that not only creates better critical thinkers and therefore, more engaged, responsible citizens, but it also cultivates wondering and curiosity and demonstrates to students that those facets of a human being are really valuable and important and worth lifelong cultivation.
No, 100%. And I think like honestly, well, the Dialexicon podcast itself exists because of that main goal in the first place, to spread philosophy to the youth. Although we do it through like, I know you have classes where it's like kind of like philosophical thinking as opposed to just straight philosophy, but I think here, because it's mainly targeted to like high schoolers, is kind of like focusing on like a lot of philosophy and targeting it at an easy level to understand, which honestly, like I think was the original is the goal of the podcast, which I think really aligns well with Plato, right? Like just kind of bringing philosophy to the youth, which the podcast has been doing pretty decent so far. So I wanted to ask on like your vision for the future with Plato, or Plato, yeah. And just like in general for philosophy education, what steps do you need do you think we need to take in order for that vision to become a reality? And you can maybe speak on like a local level within like schools, or even like a national or like international level, like what needs to happen for youth in philosophy.
Well, I think that it is a process and it takes time. I mean, I've been doing this for more than 25 years, and I have watched the growth of philosophy in schools kind of explode. I mean, it's your podcast is great. There's lots of now of resources out there for high school students and younger students who are interested in philosophy, podcasts and videos and books and all kinds of resources that did not exist 25 years ago. So I think that that's really beginning to grow and take shape. I'm of the mind that the growth of this field, if it is to kind of maintain its um, this, the greatest strengths that it has, which in my view are to kind of really develop or be grounded in respect for children and young people and what they're thinking about and the questions that are most pressing for them. And I think if we are going to continue to have that be at the core of what we're doing, then the way that this grows is the way it's been growing, which is sort of organically and from the bottom up. So kind of school after school starting to take this on, and young people starting to come to it, whether it's through an online program, whether it's through a summer program, someone talking to them about it, having a session in a classroom, whatever. I think that as that starts to grow, then philosophy will become something that is less unfamiliar for most people, and something that people start to recognize as really an important part of education. And that can take place as standalone philosophy classes. It can take place as just philosophical thinking being part of every subject. So someone who is teaching a math class isn't put off by students' questions about the nature of zero, but thinks that's a really interesting thing to talk about as part of mathematics. And I believe that if that started to happen, and if young people started to have their kind of early interest in big questions really supported and encouraged by adults, instead of what often happens now, which is that they're sort of put off. Either adults think they can't possibly understand what they're saying, or they think how adorable they are and how funny they are, rather than taking them seriously. If that all started to change, I think philosophy would find its way into education in a way that really would be powerful and valuable.
And do you think like it could be helpful if there's a push for mandating philosophy education in schools,
Yeah,
or do
I
you
have
think that's not going to work?
really mixed feelings about that. It's a topic that often comes up in our field. My own view, and there's lots of views about this, so this is just my own. I'm not speaking here for Plato necessarily, because there are people involved in Plato who I think would not necessarily agree with this. But my own view is that if we mandate it, it's going to change it in a way that I don't know whether whether it will be recognizable. And there's kind of two main reasons for that. One is that because at this point, most teachers do not have a background in philosophy, have not had experience in philosophy. Mandating it would really require kind of a kind of wholesale training of teachers that I don't know how feasible that is, and so what that might actually look like, whether it would really be of the quality that it would need to be, or whether it would be something that would end up being either, as these sessions can turn out to be, kind of an opinion sharing exercise, as opposed to really pushing student thinking. And the second reason is that right now our educational system, at least in the public schools, is very focused on testing and standards-based education. while I think standards-based education, if done correctly, there are ways to really make that powerful for philosophy. I also worry that it would turn this into kind of a, check the box. Do you know Descartes' argument about this? Do you know what this fallacy is? Do you know, et cetera, as opposed to really encouraging the kind of imaginative and open thinking that I think is the most important part of philosophy.
Yeah, that makes sense. This is also what I was thinking is like, especially because students are obviously students and they find ways to game things really, really fast. So like if there's a mandate for philosophy, it would just be gamed really quickly, or there would be like not a genuine interest into it. And it could honestly like create even more stigma because people will have general views about like, oh, now I'm heading to philosophy class, and there's like a negative kind of attitude towards it, which could be problematic, I guess, for the future and like the future of philosophy education, at least at like, like a pre-collegiate level. And I guess I also wanted to ask, just because like there is a lot of experiences that you have, teaching for such a long time and running the organization. So what is like a moment for you that is really memorable, and that kind of like is really exciting for you, or some time that you realize that Plato is making a really big difference on people's lives? Um, is there anything that stands out to you?
Um, yeah, I mean, there's lots of those moments actually. I guess one of them that's happened quite frequently is when I'm teaching or leading philosophy sessions in an elementary school. And remember, philosophy is still primarily white males. And so the academic world of philosophy has still a lot of at least perceived barriers. And when I was a graduate student, I mean, I would go to conferences and I felt very, not unwelcome, but I was very aware that I didn't belong really. I guess that's how I would put it. Um, and I think now that's really changing. And I'll have young girls who have grown up in Somalia and are new to this country come up to me and say, I'm going to be a philosopher when I grow up. And that is so meaningful to me, not just the sort of growth of the discipline, but their confidence in their thinking and intelligence and how much they have to contribute to the world is really powerful to me. And there are many times where students will say things in class that are so open and honest and thoughtful that it'll kind of stop me. One of those examples is how often students will acknowledge that they've changed their minds or that they're not sure about something in ways when I work with adults is so much more rare. And that's been really inspiring to me and allowed me to feel kind of a lot more comfortable making mistakes and trying things out. Often I'll try something in class, and if it doesn't go well, I'll think, okay, well, that didn't work, let's try something else, as opposed to feeling like it always has to be perfect and I have to be completely in control of it all.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's probably a lot of those experiences that you've had. And I can definitely see how like heartwarming it is and kind of like committed to like, I guess, expanding Plato. And I also wanted to ask just if there's any like kids right now which I guess they're already interested in philosophy listening to this podcast, but even more if if they want to find out more, what is something that they can do, through Plato's resources, or if there's ways for them, maybe even sending this podcast to a teacher, and like trying to get more people on board. Is there anything else that students can do? And also, if there eventually are like teachers listening to this, what is something that they can do, to bring philosophy to the youth?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many things that teachers and students can do. And if you get on the Plato website, there are all kinds of programs and opportunities to get involved. You can always contact me. I mean, one thing that teachers and students can do is check out our journal Questions, which is showcases young people's philosophical writing. So most of it is written by K through 12 students. and we welcome submissions. The submission deadline every year is April 30th, and that's a really wonderful way to both give students a kind of an opportunity to get published, but also to spread the word about philosophy and give people a way into philosophy to write about whatever the theme is that year in a way that's really accessible and doesn't require a great deal of sort of academic philosophical background.
Yeah, I just also wanted to.
Oh, I was just going to say, we also do a lot of free online programming. So we do a lot of webinars, we have roundtables, workshops. There's all kinds of programs that we run that are open to anyone.
Okay, yeah, that's awesome. And I just also wanted to briefly, just because Dialexicon, just the Dialexicon also has a journal for young people. That deadline is actually March 1st, though, but there is a journal also available on the Dialexicon website. But any of these resources, there's probably a lot more resources on Plato's website in terms of learning and kind of getting into philosophy. And even for teachers, I imagine there's probably resources as well, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, we also have what we call a philosophy toolkit, which has hundreds of lesson plans for leading philosophy discussions with children and youth. Activities, games, children's literature, philosophical literature, all kinds of topics, including a kind of a philosophy library of literary books that we think are philosophically suggestive. And then we have links to other places around the world that we think have particularly good resources for the classroom or other community-based philosophical forums for young people. So there's lots of those resources on the website. There's also a series of resources for parents and family members who are interested in having these kinds of conversations at home, helping them to find ways kind of into those kinds of conversations with their children.
Awesome. I will leave a link to the website in the description if anyone's interested. And I also just wanted to ask you, you've talked a lot about like your organization in Plato, but also, is there anything else that you're doing? Like, what are you doing now? Is it just expanding the services that Plato provides, or is there anything else that you're interested, like that you're focusing on now?
Yeah, I mean, I would say right now we're focusing on sort of expanding the on-the-ground programs that we have in the Seattle area to other parts of the country, and particularly the philosophy and ethics program in high schools and the philosopher in residence program in elementary, middle, and high schools. So those are kind of our current focus. But I'm also always working on articles about this work, and I'm thinking about a new book, and yeah.
Awesome. There's a lot of books, but all that information is super, super, like, there's a lot of meaningfulness to the work, especially just because the podcast also has like a similar goal and like trying to spread philosophy to youth. And me being a high school student, I feel like it's really, really beneficial for students. So I just wanted to say thank you for.
Oh, and let me just say one more thing while I'm thinking about it. The other thing that we're happy to do is provide resources for philosophy clubs. So if you're in a high school and you want to start a philosophy club, get in touch with us and we can help you think about how to do that. We can provide some resources for you, etc. So that's another area that Plato can assist young people who are interested in this.
Yeah, that's awesome. I definitely recommend that. We have our own little club at our school, and it's really, really a lot of fun. And also, like Philosophy Bowl, if it's in your region, is another really, really awesome way to get into philosophy. But that's about it for today's episode. It's a really special one just because it's kind of related to the entire goal of the podcast. And so there's a lot of like meaning, like I guess there's a lot of personal experience with also like philosophy for the youth. But I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Alone, for your time today and for being here today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.